The second episode for The Bad Batch has been released, and while there will be a full breakdown of the episode on Tapcaf Transmissions, my podcast with Eckhart's Ladder, later next week, I wanted to give a quick review, so there will be spoilers in this video. Now, coming into Bad Batch, I was kind of skeptical. It wasn't the series that I was most looking forward to out of all the ones that have been announced, and I didn't really think I'd enjoy it that much. The kind of concept of A-Team but Star Wars wasn't something that appealed to me a huge amount. But while I did enjoy the first episode, the second episode I feel like did a lot more to start bringing me around on the series. There are a few things that I've really come to appreciate through this episode, but also I think some pretty big missed opportunities that I hope get addressed later on, and I assume will get addressed later on, but where I feel like some of the events in this episode would have been a great opportunity to do that. First though, I want to talk about some of those positives and where I think the show is being handled really well. The main thing that I was concerned about coming into the show was the characters. I wasn't a huge fan of them in the Bad Batch arc of the Clone Wars Season 7, and I was kind of worried that a show based on them, they weren't really going to be enough to carry that. With the addition of Echo at the end of that arc though, and with the fleshing out that Hunter's gotten so far, I think that's become less of a concern for me. Wrecker and Tech are still kind of on that side of not really bringing as much to the table from a character perspective. Sure, there's some comedy moments with each of them, and Tech does a lot to kind of do some of the exposition that the show needs. I do hope we'll get a bit more from them on a character level as we go along. What I have actually really appreciated, especially with this episode, but also with the first episode, that I think is a bit more controversial, is what Omega actually brings to the group. Child characters, especially in Star Wars media, but it's kind of a broad thing across all types of media, can be seen as kind of annoying or a distraction from what's actually going on in the show. But I think that Omega brings something that the show really needs, and it wouldn't quite be the same without her. Aside from some level of longer-term mystery trying to figure out who she was and where she came from that Cut brought up in today's episode, Omega is there to kind of reflect that all of these clones are in a new kind of life, something very different from what they've been doing before, and with Omega it's a lot more obvious than the other ones. When the clones get to Seleucami, we see Omega's reaction, and it's so different from what she's used to on Kamino, but for all of the clones they're kind of going through this, where they've fought for so long on the side of the clones in the Clone Wars, and they were fighting the droids, they had a clear purpose, and now everything's a bit more open-ended for them. They know they need to survive and stay away from the Empire, but what their goals are going to be are a lot less defined than when they were living as soldiers fighting a war. Omega helps to characterize this not just with her own reactions and her own experience going through this, but also giving Hunter and the other clones of the Bad Batch a new skill that they have to learn, namely parenting. And that's a big part of this episode, obviously, having gone to see Cut, who we were introduced to in the Clone Wars, where we saw him as a deserter having gone and joined a family. Through Cut, Hunter not only gets some parenting advice, but we kind of see that these clones aren't just a mass of the same person. They all have their own choices and struggles that they're going through. This was something that was obviously a big part of what the Clone Wars was able to establish, and something that it really added to the Star Wars universe. We also get the mention of Rex, who had come through the day before the Bad Batch had to see Cut, and we see him, of course, later show up in Rebels. It's entirely possible we'll see Rex come across the Bad Batch in the future as well, as they kind of decide what it means for each of them to no longer be part of the Grand Army of the Republic. But with this theme of individuality and the brotherhood between the clones, we get to something that I feel like could have been handled a lot better in this episode, or something that I felt was missing from this episode at least. With the action of the first episode and the emotional impact of having to leave Crosshair behind, we never really got a reaction from them for having to fight the other clone troopers. Now, Bad Batch has always been somewhat separated from the other clones and seen themselves as different, but they would have still considered themselves brothers with the rest of the clone troopers, and we see them in last episode and this episode kind of fighting with no real pause given to the fact that they are now fighting people who they know are being controlled or were being forced into executing Order 66 and may not be acting entirely of their own accord right now. Their interactions with Crosshair are definitely going to be the major part of this kind of arc, trying to see how they'll relate to the other clones, but I felt like this episode could have had a bit more examination of what's going on there. I think it'd be a shame, after all the work the Clone Wars cartoon did to set up all the clones as being their own individuals with their own identities, to then kind of throw that away and have them become fodder, not just for any enemy, but for our heroes as clone troopers themselves, there could have been a lot more to explore there. There's a bigger discussion about the use of the chips versus the clones following because they were well trained or of their own free will, but I think even with the chip interpretation, or especially with the chip interpretation, there could be more of a kind of moral question for the Bad Batch on how they feel about fighting their former comrades. Even if it's ultimately decided that it's for their own, if it's something they can't avoid, we could have seen some sort of reaction from them that this was a hard thing for them to do. And I do think that kind of thing was what was missing from this episode. And I do hope we get more examination of that as we go on, beyond just how they're relating to Crosshair, even though I do expect that to be kind of the main focal point of that. One other thing that I have liked about the series so far in the first 2 episodes is that we do get to see this transition from the Republic and the Empire in some of the more mundane ways that I didn't really expect to see coming in. Between the identifiers this episode and Tarkin's discussion about the Empire not being beholden for the Republic's debts, which I do think is kind of weird because they are continuing the Clone Trooper program, so I don't know if I would buy that argument if I was the Kaminoans, but you're also not really in a position to fight the entire Empire. But that kind of world building is something that I've always appreciated, so I'm glad we're able to get it in such a high profile location. Before, it would have been the kind of thing that was relegated to either source books or just anywhere that basic information was needed that wasn't really considered to be super important to a story, so it is nice seeing it kind of front and center here. On the whole though, I have been enjoying the Bad Batch so far. I'm definitely getting more into it than I thought I would going in, so I'm looking forward to seeing where the series goes. Hope you've enjoyed the review. Again, you can look forward to a longer discussion of the first 2 episodes on probably Monday or Tuesday. There is going to be the Twin Suns tournament being put on by Eckhart's Ladder and Star Wars Squadrons this weekend, so make sure you go over to X channel, I'll link in the description, and check that out. We're going to have 2 more videos coming out this weekend about kind of Bad Batch inspired topics talking about clone troopers. Either way, thank you for watching and hope to see you next time. Bye everyone.